For a long time, companies treated their learning programs like overhead. Nice to have, easy to cut. Not anymore. With tech, AI, and skills evolving fast, learning isn't just about HR or mandatory compliance. Learning is a competitive advantage. It's how you keep up. Learning is how you enable sellers, onboard talent, educate customers, and scale faster. It's how you act, adapt, and evolve. And at Docebo, learning is what we do. So for learning that never stops, start with Docebo. Docebo, never stop learning.
Look at him, eating whatever he wants, never gaining a pound. While I'm stuck with the boring special and can't lose an ounce.
How's your lunch, man?
Amazing. Yours?
So good.
Oh, I'm so happy for you.
Cool, buddy.
Weight loss isn't fair, but Mochi Health is. The affordable GLP-1 source that can fix your frustration with food.
So, same time next week?
No!
Definitely.
And your friends. Learn more at joinmochi.com. Mochi members have access to licensed physicians and nutritionists. Results may vary.
Dawn Scott, welcome to the Sports Management Podcast.
Thank you, Marcus. Thank you for the invite to be on.
It's great to have you on the show. You're a high-performance consultant and have worked a lot in the football industry, have your own company, Dawn Scott Elite Performance Consulting. So talking about high performance, what are some high-performing habits that you have noticed in your work?
Oh, that's a great question. I've had this conversation so many times with so many different people in terms of what does that mean? Does it mean different things at different levels of participation, whether it's kind of grassroots or further down the pyramid or kind of at the elite level? I think for me, some of it is consistency of behaviors. I think aiming for a target or a goal. Do you ever kind of achieve like the pinnacle or excellence, or is there always somewhere beyond there once you get there? So I think in part it's consistency of behaviors. I think it's relentless pursuit of a goal or a target would be my key thing. And then I think once you have those things, I think you start defining an environment, a culture around it in terms of how you intend to get there and how you maybe intend to stay there.
In your opinion, how important is motivation?
I think it's massive because I think if you don't have that, it becomes hard to, one, like if you're a practitioner, is to have athletes or coaches, other staff committed to what you're doing. I think if you don't have that yourself, I think for so many years I've been privileged to be involved in football and women's football. And I think without that inner drive and motivation, I'm not sure I would have or could have stayed in it as long or committed the hours and sacrifices that I did to it. So I think it's really important because I think if you don't have that, I don't know, maybe your job or your role is a job rather than maybe something that you kind of enjoy doing. And once you stop enjoying something, maybe that is a time to kind of review, reflect, if not before then, to consider kind of moving on and moving into something else.
Interesting, because you mentioned consistency, and sometimes it's the question about what's most important. Is it to being consistent or being motivated? With the argument usually that motivation comes and goes, while if you are consistent, that's something in itself that you're doing anyway.
Yeah, but I do think you can be both and you might have different levels of both. But if you're not consistent, for me, you maybe it's not achieving those higher standards, depending what it is you're doing. Like, yeah, I think you can go through times of fatigue or, I don't know, sometimes maybe it's a bit of monotony, but I think you can still keep those consistent behaviors. But yeah, I think, again, that motivation piece in life generally, I think is important to, I don't know, achieve your dreams or your goals of what you intend for either career professionally and or kind of in your personal life.
For sure. So I would like to go through your career journey, and then we might stop here and there and go through some things because you have been through a lot and a lot of successes. You joined the England's women's national football team as head of sports science in 2001. How did you get that job, and how was that first time?
25 years ago, women's football was a very, very different landscape. I think football was as well. I think since then, there's been a lot of evolution in terms of fund and investment, technology, social media, communication. Back then in those early days, like email was barely a new thing, let alone kind of communicating through phones, etc. So I studied sports science. I did try 2 other degrees before I got to sports science. I wasn't really sure what I wanted to do when I left school. I think, again, at that time, being a girl, like there wasn't role models or trailblazers in sport or even in like STEM subjects. So science, technology, engineering, maths. But I was very kind of mathematical in my thinking at school. I studied physics, maths, electronics. I started a physics degree, again, passed first year, started an accountancy degree, passed the first year, but again, wasn't sure where that was taking me. And then sports science was then on my radar again when I was first going to university in 1990. Like sports science wasn't really a big thing to study in the UK. Liverpool Polytechnic at the time, not even Liverpool John Moores, was probably one of the few around the country. I also remember kind of going to Kent to visit as well in terms of a sport course. So then it was kind of third time lucky, did sport and exercise science at Manchester Met, which was actually the Crewe and Alsager faculty at the time. Again, once I finished that 3-year degree, didn't really know like you could go and work in sport, even though I'd studied sports science. So happened to see an advert for a sports nutrition master's up in Aberdeen, which again was the second year of that, where Susan Sheriffs, Ron Moore and John Leeper were the people kind of driving that course. So went and did that. And then similar at the end of that, it wasn't that I jumped straight into kind of applied sport. I actually lectured at University of Worcester for 3.5 years. And that enabled me to do a few things. One was apply some of the principles of sports science into kind of learning and teaching, but then also do some research myself. Again, at that time, like you didn't really read about women's football in the news and the media. So again, I kind of sought out women's football. In 1999, I was fortunate enough to be in the US and somebody had a ticket for the Women's World Cup final, which, you know, is gold dust these days. But back then, again, it was like, do you want to come to the game? I was like, yeah, sure. But didn't probably realize or appreciate the size of it. 90,000 plus fans packed into the Rose Bowl. And I think that just kind of lit a fire and a passion for me. And when I got back to England, I did some support of some of the top women's teams in England at the time, Southampton Saints, Doncaster Rover Bells, and then did some bits of research and was fortunate to go out to Sydney and presented at one of the World Congress on Science and Football. And then I started contacting Hope Powell, who was the manager of the England women's team at the time, and sharing some of the research. This was all by letter. It wasn't even by email, because again, that's where communication was. So I'd literally do my research. And again, out of that, myself and the two other colleagues, we got a couple of publications kind of from that research, and I shared them with Hope. And then in 2001, they advertised for a role as exercise scientist working with the women's team. And I applied and went through the kind of recruiting process and was fortunate to get the role. And again, back then, it was a very different environment of very little funding, very little support in terms of like people knowing about the women's football team. It wasn't advertised. The players were amateur, like training with their clubs 1 to 2 times a week, playing matches on a weekend. And so it was really building out a support program for those players, education, building a sports science kind of program for those players. And again, fitness levels were low, nutritional habits were not very good. And I guess across many of those years, I worked as the performance department, supporting across all of those areas for the players to try and accelerate that kind of fitness and physical development.
That's interesting. So you mentioned that 25 years ago, it was a different, of course, view on nutrition and sports performance and exercise science. You said that they were maybe not having great eating habits and training habits. So what do you see, like comparing today with then? How big is that difference?
Knowledge and support and resource around those players. I mean, I think you could say knowledge, good and bad. There's a lot of disinformation and misinformation on social media and the internet, etc. But obviously, we now have got many qualified dietitians or sports nutritionists working in women's football. Like, if I kind of focus on that, like I even remember going to the launch of the Adidas Predator, which was kind of in the early 2000s, and Kevin Keegan was there at the launch, and he spoke about in his day their pre-match meal was like chips, steak and eggs. And so, yes, it's evolved on the women's side, but it's evolved on the men's side as well in terms of kind of the applied advice and guidance for players around the whole area of support, and nutrition being one. So I think one is like knowledge and information. I think education of players. I think also education and information specific to the female player and the female lens. We can't just apply what's been done on the men's side. And again, this is where, you know, only 6% of the sports science research is totally focused on females. So there's also that kind of knowledge and research gap, so that some of our guidance and advice can be more informed from the research, but that's going to take time to translate and implement. So again, it's that support around players in terms of the environment of staffing around their specialist support generally for education, but also that individual kind of support for players, whether it is nutrition, psychology, training periodization, recovery, etc. There's now research coming out around periodization of recovery and what that should look like. So again, I think there's so much out there in terms of individualizing the support for any single player. But again, that's a male player or a female player. Again, I think it's just there's more information and science out there.
For sure. And you mentioned so many great things there, and I want to dissect that a little bit. So first of all, you mentioned the misinformation. So what do you feel right now is some information that is floating around out that is not actually proven?
I think rather than like one specific thing, I think generally, again, you can go into the search engine on any kind of internet platform, and as human beings, like the curiosity of either doing that or going into some of those AI platforms. Again, I think sometimes some of them can be misinformed, and that's not necessarily based on scientific knowledge or evidence. I think in women's sport, we've had a period of time where players have maybe been fearful of eating carbohydrate, which are a key source of fuel during football training and or kind of match play. And obviously the knock-on effect is then potentially underfueling in female players, which potentially can then lead to eating disorders, bone mineral density issues, and kind of almost the female athlete triad, and players then not having regular menstrual cycles. So again, it's that whole kind of support and kind of filter out of how it impacts the player more widely with their kind of performance recovery and health stays. Like again, in a female, in the kind of reproductive years, like a healthy menstrual cycle is just a good sign of health status, in that the body is in normal kind of homeostasis, not in a stress state of underfueled or overtrained or under-recovered. So I think rather than like any research out there that says anything kind of untoward or bad, I think it's more just if any human being does go out and search, again, you can get mis or disinformation on the internet because so much is out there and available, and similar for kind of AI platforms. And I think we have to remember the human and the human kind of knowledge and voice at the center of everything that we do.
Definitely. A lot of new information we have today versus 25 years ago, obviously. And in your role, you need to stay up to date with the information. So how are you conducting your research and getting up to date with what's coming in terms of research on this topic?
Yeah, I mean, I think part of it is surrounding myself by people who are specialists or more knowledgeable than me in specific areas. And I have people that I kind of rely on or go to if I want to know about latest research in certain areas, and also try and kind of read around latest research and kind of research myself. And so with FIFA, I've been working on some projects over the last few years, which really is focused on the female lens. In the next few months, they'll be releasing a platform with some female health education modules kind of focused purely on the female player. And with that project, it's been not the work of one person, but almost 30 to 40 plus experts globally, combination of academics and researchers, applied practitioners who've kind of come together and developed some of that content. So again, I'm not ignorant enough to think that I know everything. I feel like the more I read, it's that saying, the more I read, I feel like the more I realize I don't know. And I'm always kind of listening to podcasts as well. I think that's a great way of listening to some of the latest research kind of out there as well, in terms of either the female player or leadership management, etc. So again, I think just trying to read books, listen to podcasts, reach out to kind of people I know, network in terms of the latest thinking and understanding. And also, like, there's more than one way of doing something, or there's always kind of more than one opinion. So again, it's trying to kind of read what's out there and not either come up with your own kind of thoughts, opinion, or applying what you feel like is appropriate to that environment or to that individual situation or person.
Yeah. And you mentioned previously that only 6% of the research is done on females. So, I mean, there is a huge blind spot there potentially, right?
Yeah, there is. I mean, that is focused purely on females. Like there's some of that research outside that 6% that is on mixed kind of males and females. And also, I think it's worth acknowledging there is an increase in the amount of research being done. You know, there's certain institutes globally now who are committing funding to doing kind of more research. I think it came out in 2001. So that's kind of been bandied around for the last 4 or 5 years. So there is an increase in number of groups or institutions doing kind of research. Again, just that translation and application will take time. And I think as well, it's important that the kind of methods are done well in terms of like females, both again, UEFA released a consensus statement earlier this year or kind of last year in terms of menstrual cycle tracking for research and then also for actually practitioners, like gold standard and what a minimum should be and what the absolute gold standard should be. So again, I think further research should look to follow some of that guidance so that, again, we get good quality research out there.
Definitely, that's so important. Some things that I've heard about, I don't know if this is backed up by science, but we're talking about football boots, for example. Should there be specific boots for women because you're having on average wider hips, which means a different angle to your feet and your knees? There's also the myth about the ACL injuries. How do you see some of these aspects?
Not even just the anatomy of the hips, like the female foot has got a different shape and configuration to the male foot, where it's a wider front foot and a narrow heel. So again, I think if you think about a female putting their foot into a men's boot, which typically is narrow at the front and wider at the back, then straight away you might have traction of the foot in a boot like that, even though it might be, I don't know, the right size. I think that itself, and then, even then looking at the stud configuration, that if females do have a wider front foot and narrower heel and the stud configuration is the same as narrower front and wider heel, then 100% like that should be a consideration. And I think in terms of ACL injuries and injuries generally, like they are so multifactorial. We can't just pin ACL injuries on any one thing. Again, I think the need out there is to do a big kind of data study on a big kind of data set and have all of the things collected or accounted for that could contribute to ACL injuries. And I don't think we'll ever just find one cause. I think, again, it would be multifactorial. And then I think all we can do is support players in the best way. There's injury prevention programs and those injury prevention programs work. Yet how many either youth teams or, even elite teams dedicate enough time to injury prevention prior to starting training sessions? So that is a quick win. And Matt Whalen, who's part of the kind of FIFA group who's done some of that education, has done research in those areas. The other one is the environment around the player of, is it optimal for kind of player kind of growth? And Stella Veach has done some work on the environment of like almost the greenhouse effect, that if you want to kind of nurture talent or individuals, you need to put the right environment around them. And, that includes like staffing, facilities, structure, technology. Also, Joanne Parsons, Steph Cohen have done some work on the gendered environment. So again, it's not just sex differences and physiology. You need to look at gendered factors, societal factors, and technology. And again, you've mentioned kind of footwear, also kind of bra support, pelvic health, return to play postpartum. Again, we've got Professor Maggie Davenport, Emma Brockwell, Sinead Dufour, and Evie Casagrande, who've done some great work on return to play and return to training guidelines for postpartum kind of females. And again, you see now more and more players, especially in football, whereas kind of maybe 10, 15 years ago, there was less players having families and then returning to sport, especially at the elite level. I think now you see many players doing that because there is now more guidance and support and education. And again, I think that is where that kind of knowledge is there, and it's backed by science and it's backed by kind of expertise. So again, I think it's putting the right environment, staffing, knowledge and education around kind of any individual.
Definitely. And again, super important topic. And I think on average nowadays, women are having children later in age than a couple of years ago also. So do you still see that maybe some players wait until after their career? Or obviously there needs to be a support if you want to do that during your career as well. But how do you see that mix?
I mean, I don't know the stats on that. I wouldn't say it's my area of expertise. Yeah, I think some do because maybe they don't want to go through kind of that return to play and train kind of process at that time. And I think, again, depending on the level of the player, if they're playing international competition as well, they pretty much European players are pretty much playing international competition if they're in the Olympics as well, pretty much every year. So again, I think a lot of the time it is the timing of that. Yeah, I think some have kind of delayed and had post-career, like Carly Lloyd being an example there. But you also have Alex Morgan, who had children too during her career and returned. Also worked with Christy Pearce, kind of Rampone, kind of many years ago, who again had 2 children and returned to play. So Shannon Box, Amy Shillan, there's many players out there, Katie Chapman, Mary Phillip. Like there's many players out there who have returned. I think a recent one was seen on kind of social media just because she was plotting some of it was Claire Emsley at Angel City. But again, you could tell that there was guidance around that of kind of the load that she should be following pre-pregnancy, that she was being kind of tracked and monitored in terms of heart rate intensity and also her speed on her kind of GPS. So again, I think just that guidance and knowing that there is informed, educated specialist support for those players, I think is fantastic because again, a female should be supported like any athlete and be able to have children at any stage of life and also be empowered to perform on any day of their menstrual cycle and at any point throughout their kind of their years of reproductive kind of life.
Definitely. And that's also something like your role and to be in, a high performance manager or a sports scientist for a team. I mean, it's much more common today than when you started. So this becoming more and more common in teams. And of course, that's super beneficial for the topics that you mentioned there.
Yeah, for sure. I think it's important for any kind of environment that you develop the staffing and the system based on the environment that you're in. And that's whether that is a male environment or a female environment. I think it's what's the vision of the company, of the organization? What is their org chart and structure? What are their behaviors? And then I think from that, if you know kind of the aims, the vision of the organization, you then, what is the budget associated with that? What staffing can you look at? Is it a group where you start with a big staff or start small and grow, or you have many roles, but in more kind of part-time but specialist roles? I think again, for probably 10 or 15 years of my career, I was the performance department. And I think you also have some practitioners who have the head of performance title, but they're basically head of themselves because they don't have any staff bigger than that. I think there's also been some discussion lately of the different titles of head of director of performance, director of sports science, like what do all the different titles mean? So again, I think it's what is the organization that you're at? What's their vision? What are your own values? Do they align with the values of the organization? And then I think the big piece really in that whole process is the recruitment of the staff. Like, so again, what does that org chart look like? What do you need? Like for me, working in the women's game, it's really important to have practitioners, or at least a large portion of those practitioners in the department who've had experience of working with female athletes. And there are certain positions that for me are you have to have them. I think it's a non-negotiable. So again, it's what are those roles that are most important? Having a female health expert who can maybe help some of the other practitioners within your department if they don't have that applied knowledge or experience, I think is important as well. So, but again, you might have this kind of structure that you want to recruit for, and you might get a person with a certain kind of quality here. So actually that means you can tinker kind of what you're looking for over here. So again, it's looking at the individual appointment, but the group as a whole, and what does that look like? And then also, what is your recruitment process and who is doing that? Again, I think it seems to be common now that there's recruitment agencies or firms brought in to do some of the hires. But what is their background and expertise? Have they worked in, the environment of women's sport or women's football? And do they know what is needed? Again, what does your job description look like? And what are you asking the candidates to do? Is it a CV? Is it a kind of a cover letter? And again, even the length of a CV is important because, again, I think sometimes when you recruit for many roles and there's many applications, there might be key things you're looking for. And so what does that look like? And then are you going to have the candidates do any tasks? And actually, in this day and age of being able to do everything online, it's harder to do kind of in-person tasks and really determine that person. But I think making sure the person and, their attributes and do they fit in with a group, let alone their experience and knowledge and qualifications, for me is something that should be probably, of more importance than kind of the experience and knowledge alongside that. So I really do think that recruitment process is so important for any organization.
Definitely. Bouncing back to your career, you spent almost 1 decade first at the England women's national team. What are some highlights from these years?
Again, a great question, because we grew from having very minimal support, the players kind of being kind of amateur, and then eventually working with Hope Howell. She fought a lot with the English Football Association to get some centralized contracts for players, which meant they could reduce some of their kind of working hours in their pro jobs day to day and actually have more time available to train. I think some of the education of the players to empower them to take ownership of their own training or recovery was important. I think if you look at success on the field, by the end of my time there in 2007, we qualified for the World Cup. 2009, we reached the European Championship final, which, again, was a fantastic achievement to get to a final. But then we got beat 6-2 heavily by Germany. So again, we've come so far, but there's still this big gap. How do we keep closing that gap? I think the other piece, like by the end of my almost 10 years there, you feel fatigued with all the travel. And it also been fortunate that I could start bringing other practitioners in to start working across some of the youth teams or working regionally with the players in small groups. So Naomi Datson came in and worked at the Loughborough Player Academy that we had at the time, worked across some of the youth teams. Ellie Mabry came in and supported some of the players regionally, Mark Arnott. And again, being able to then work with other practitioners and kind of get insight and feedback from them, I think was good to start growing and supporting the program. So yeah, I think, and then just seeing like the individual players progress. I was very fortunate to work with Karen Carney from the age of 14 when she came in, and you then support and you get to know the families and kind of that thing, and support the player throughout her journey of development, and what she then did throughout her career. And working with Kelly Smith, for me, probably one of the best players ever that there ever was kind of in the game. And sometimes I think it's some players or some current people involved in women's football don't know who she is. And I'm like, she's a legend of the game and had so much. So I think there's like the personal relationships with staff or players. I think the personal growth of myself across that time. And then just all the privileged chance of supporting the England women's team across like so many games and learning from other practitioners and coaches and your own communication throughout that whole process. So I just think there's many, many learnings, and I'm still learning now. And again, I think being brave to go into different environments and learn from different people and be open to saying that you don't know everything, I think is a good thing to do as well.
Definitely. And you mentioned different environments, and you moved on from the England's national team to the United States women's national team. Was that a sensitive move to go from one national team to another?
I think it's an interesting question. I think probably right now would be more yes than then. I think back then, England was still a developing team in terms of women's football. The US were ranked number one in the world and, had held that for a long time and was deemed as very kind of physical fit, far ahead of many other teams. They'd also had a program where Title IX in US meant that sports in colleges had to commit the same funding to women's sports as men. So a lot of that went into women's football in the US. So you almost had players going through the college system where at times in the year, like they're training full time. Also in the US, again, there's the history of the 85ers, the 99ers, the whole Trailblazers through that whole period of time. The 99ers obviously winning the World Cup, but then also having the WUSA, the Women's Professional USA kind of league, and then the Women's Professional Soccer League. So again, they started to have some professional leagues and were the kind of first to do that. I think Italy had one in the 90s, which didn't last that long. You kind of had players who were in that full time. I don't think it was seen as a rival. And if I'm honest, once I had communication from US Soccer that they might be like bringing in a full-time fitness coach for the first time, I discussed it with Hope Powell because I was kind of flattered by the interest. And I think back then in 2009-10, I probably didn't think about the gravity of moving from the UK right to the west coast of the US. Technology was different, communication was different. Zoom or Skype was just kind of starting out as a communication platform. I discovered WhatsApp when I did make the decision to leave. And so again, that was probably my main platform for keeping in touch with family and friends. So yeah, again, discussed it with Hope. And again, I felt like I'd kind of done 9.5, 10 years with England women's team. Kind of felt like for me, like a new challenge was important, but also for the players to have a new voice and input would also help them and benefit them to take it to the next stage. So I guess it was kind of twofold of taking the opportunity and again, having watched the team in the 99 World Cup final and, again, being then approached and having conversations with Pia where it was a big salary cut to go there. Not that I was on big money at England, but in the end, like I remember having a conversation with Pia and she said it's not always about the money, it's about the journey. And that just kind of made my final decision of, okay, I'm going to take the chance and kind of move out and come and support the team.
Wow, what a story. I mean, that's taking, as you said, a big pay cut and moving to the West Coast in the US, leaving family and friends behind. That's a big leap. It's a bold move.
Yeah, I mean, again, I think at the time, like I'm somebody who's like kind of just steady and calm in my emotions. And yeah, I think on the day when I flew out, I remember kind of being upset with mom family of moving over there because suddenly at the time I was kind of living Shrewsbury way near to Lilleshall. So it was like, whatever, 3-4 hour drive home, whereas now it was 12-14 hour kind of journey and 8-hour time difference. But there was kind of tears when I left, but then it was literally like took 2-3 bags, cases and jumped on a plane. Literally when I got to California, was put up for one night in a hotel and then literally had to kind of fend for myself. So it was kind of a steep learning curve of getting your social security number, again, which wasn't an easy process, took a few months to get that sorted to then get paid. And again, I think just that resilience of kind of being strong and keep pushing and then to work with that team and with Pia and, the coaches since then was, just an unbelievable opportunity kind of that I was given.
And a lot of success during these years. As you mentioned, the US national team was the number one from, I think, early 2000s and onwards. But when you were there, it was an Olympic gold in 2012 and 2 World Cup titles. So that must have been quite experience.
Yeah, it was incredible. And I think sometimes you want to go back and live it all again. I think obviously it being last year, being the 10-year anniversary of the 2015 World Cup is just like, wow, I can't believe it was that long ago. Sometimes it feels like not that long ago, and sometimes it does feel like a long time. That thing recently where people have been posting their 2016 images and you see some of the players from that time where they look really young, like Lindsay Horan, Mallory Pugh Swanson, Emily Sonnet, and you're like, wow, like they look like babies then. Yeah, it was just an incredible time. The players obviously had success, like I say, kind of athletes and dominant. And so again, all the time it was like, what can I bring? How can I add value? And again, it was looking that full complement of support, starting to make their training more scientific, more related to football rather than kind of running drills and just running, and how do you incorporate the ball. I remember working with Pia a lot on that, where she wanted everything with the ball. And I was like, we need to get the players warmed up and ready for that. And then kind of there's some activities that we might look to do without the ball because it might be more time efficient, or individual players might need that, or what kind of individual dose different players kind of want or need. The education of the players. So again, looking at that full complement of recovery, nutrition, hydration, sleep. Again, the individual support in the different areas, because even at that time, the National Women's Soccer League started in 2013, but most of those teams had minimal staff, maybe 3 staff, and didn't really have sports science or performance support. So a lot of my role initially was involved in traveling to each of those environments, supporting either the national team players there and or the players generally, and kind of working alongside the head coaches. Vlatko and Andonovsky was Casey Current head coach. So again, going in and supporting him. And in Kansas, they had players like Lauren Holiday, Nicole Barnhart, Amy Schilling. So again, it was kind of going in and supporting those players, but then also supporting the league as a whole. And eventually in 2015-16, was able to bring in more staff and really provide sports science support across the whole league. And you now see it thriving, and the size of the departments and the fund and the investment. And again, it's just incredible to see where it is now, given, where we started back in 2013.
I understand that it's been a couple of years since, and as you said, the whole women's football have evolved so much over the last 2-3 decades.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, it's incredible. I think the investment is unbelievable, and the support of the players, the transfer fees, the salaries. The thing we need to make sure, there is a imbalance of kind of loads where there's some overload of players and some on underload. And FIFA Pro have released a report kind of this year and for the last few years where you do have some players play many games, kind of those largely probably European-based players who have a lot of domestic club games, but then also Champions League and then national team. But then you also do have some players who are not international players who almost have an underload. So again, I think it's making sure we can support players across the whole spectrum, and then also making sure the environments in terms of staffing, facilities, structure is optimal for the female player. And again, making sure that there is that applied female lens and knowledge within that staffing group, because I also think what we have seen is that as there has been increased investment and higher salaries, you see more practitioners and staff come from men's sport. And so again, I think it's important to make sure that those staff coming in have that applied female lens and knowledge and understanding of the female player as well.
Definitely. Then you took on a role at FIFA during this time as well. So you were doing those simultaneously as a consultant role?
Yeah, so in 2014, I was approached to be part of the group to write a report following the World Cup on the physical analysis of the teams. And since then, I've then kind of been part of the group to write that in 2015, 19 and 23. And then I guess in the last 5 years, I've kind of been working on a few projects again, focused on supporting the practitioner with the female lens. So again, some of that female health education should be coming out in the next kind of month or so. And then a program supporting some of the national teams around supporting some of their practitioners, again, really focused on the female lens. So yeah, again, I've been fortunate to kind of support those programs, build those out. Belinda Wilson, who's the Senior Women's Technical Development Manager at FIFA, has kind of been a real driver kind of on the ground with FIFA for that. And then alongside kind of Rick Lovell and Kelly McNulty with that applied female lens, and Connie Marshall from a kind of adult learning perspective has helped me kind of grow and learn every single day in terms of kind of bouncing things off those guys as well. So again, yeah, very fortunate to be involved in some of those projects.
That sounds really interesting. So how does your work look nowadays? What does your day-to-day look like in 2026?
Yeah, no, it's very interesting. It's very different from kind of 12, 13 months ago, where again, for 25 years, I'd done kind of the national teams and then into Miami and then Washington Spirit. I think right now I do the FIFA work for a few days a week and then just consulting on a few different projects with different groups, some of it around facilities specific for female players, some of it around consulting with a couple of teams around some of their departments, their structure, their kind of systems and processes. Again, was fortunate in the last few years where I supported kind of one team, but then also that global lens across multi-teams. So kind of got insight and experience a little bit of kind of applying a model across multi-teams, not just in one kind of location. So that's a real passion of mine, of making sure like the environment, the recruitment, kind of the values, etc., kind of are aligned within a department. And again, ultimately with that applied female lens. And then just a few kind of speaking kind of conferences, engagements. So again, they've ranged from specifics around part of my journey or specific areas of support through to kind of leadership areas as well. So yeah, again, kind of launched website November last year, and yeah, just kind of exploring a little bit some of the different kind of areas of support to see where it is I might want to go more into or less into, and never really closing the door on going back full time into a club or a kind of multi-club support. Again, I think for me right now, it would just have to be the right opportunity, the right environment, kind of right vision to align with kind of my values, to want to give my kind of all in a situation like that, but just still massively passionate about women's football and women's sport, and wanting to not necessarily just see the great game grow, because I think we've seen massive growth and massive evolution, but just keep pushing the game on, because I think we've only seen a snapshot of where women's sports can get to. And I think it's such an exciting time for women's sports.
Definitely. And it leads me into a different question as well. If we are looking ahead into the future for women's sport, that you said it's been so much growth, but any predictions that you have for women's football in the future?
Wow, this is a massive one. I honestly don't know. I think there's been such an evolution over the last like 4-8 years. Like when I think even from 2015 to 19, working with a national team and just seeing the standard at the World Cup was incredible. I think there's talk in the next World Cup, not in 2027, but the one after that, to increase the number of teams. So therefore, I think what we need to make sure is that overtrain, undertrain, that we keep pushing up those players who maybe are not playing as much as the players at the top end. I think, again, the research and the insights, I think, again, as more groups are doing that, I think I'm excited to now get more and more guidance and kind of strategies that are led and more informed from kind of science and research, rather than some of that kind of guesswork from what's out there or from strategies applied simply from men's sports. So I think kind of more data-driven, data-led or science-led information and guidance for female players, for me, I think is going to be something. And, looking at governance and policies for the kind of players and leagues kind of moving forward to ultimately just give the players the best opportunity and chance to kind of perform and to succeed in football, not even just women's football, just in football. Like, again, I think that growth has been massive, and I'm just excited at where it continues to kind of grow and flourish and just entertain worldwide, because it's such an exciting opportunity and kind of sport to watch.
Yeah, me too, for sure. If someone wants to work in the women's footballs, in the football industry, maybe at large, or specifically in the women's football, what's some advice that you have for them, for a young person who wants to take this career journey?
I think anything is achievable. So I think, again, it's like, if you can see it, be it. So again, do your research of what area is it that is of interest. And also, it does take hard work to get there, and it does take some resilience. I think, again, having been a female in a male-dominated sport and environment for many years, like, has taken a lot of like resilience in myself, and has taken a long time for me to kind of speak up and have a voice, because it can be intimidating, it can be hard. But again, I think really seek out what it is you want to be. Like, it's not just being a player. Like, you can be anything, whether it is a sports scientist, psychologist, coach, administrator, equipment person, social media content, etc. Like, there's so many roles and opportunities out there. I think you also have to do your research and know what it is, and kind of do some of that work yourself. And then I think whatever the qualification it is to get there, I think then seek out any voluntary or opportunities to work with so many different people, because I think developing those soft skills and communication skills of working with different people, I think do some self-work of knowing yourself. I think that's probably been one of my growths over the last 6-7 years, of knowing yourself, of maybe it's how a behavior you think it's this, but actually somebody else perceives it as this, and what impact does it have on them? And so I think that open mindset and growth mindset of kind of learning about yourself, but then also being open to change or adapt or flex, either in different such situations or different people. And I think you only can learn or get to do that by experiencing different people or situations. So I think one is seek out, do research of what it is you want to be, what qualifications might get you there, seek out some of those voluntary experiences, and then, I think kind of pursue it, like dream it, believe it, achieve it. I think, again, like, sorry, I know they're kind of like corny sayings, but I honestly think that anything is possible now in women's sports.
Definitely. And things are cliches for a reason. It's because usually they are true.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
It's been a pleasure talking to you for almost an hour here. I would like to end on a networking question. So who from your network do you think would be a good guest on this show?
That's a great question. I mean, there's so many. Like, it depends whether it's someone who's kind of more in a leadership position, someone who's experienced kind of different environments. Like, again, thinking about practitioners who've gone across different environments, you've got somebody like Julie Twaddle, who worked the English Institute of Sport in the UK, worked at Manchester City Women, is now working in the NWSL, so has kind of worked across different environments, different roles. You've got people in academia like Professor Margie Davenport, who again has been the person who's kind of led and developed a lot of these return to play guidelines. And then, I know Andrea Hudy, who's at University of Connecticut leading the women's basketball program. And again, has got many years of experience, kind of previous Tina Murray, who's high performance director at US Soccer. So they're probably kind of some of the names I would throw out there, depending on what it is you actually want and you want to look for. Again, I think all just really fascinating people where you could learn a lot in terms of their kind of role involved, and in women's sport, kind of for some of them in terms of where they've gone to.
I love that. Great suggestions. Joe Scott, thank you so much for taking the time to be on Sports Management Podcast.
No worries. Thank you, Marcus.
Thank you for listening to the Sports Management Podcast. Please hit the follow or subscribe button on your podcast app so you don't miss out on any upcoming episodes. If you want to get in contact with me, send an email to sportsmpodcast@gmail.com, connect with me on LinkedIn, or follow the podcast on Instagram, X, and Facebook @SportsMPodcast.
It feels like AI can do everything. Write the code, analyze the data. It can even suggest your next move. But there's one thing AI can't do. Think for your people. With AI, the real advantage isn't the tools. Anyone can do that. The real advantage is human readiness. That's why the smartest companies aren't asking, do we have AI? They're asking, can our people keep up? To build a learning program that keeps your people ahead, learn with Docebo. Docebo. Never stop learning.